Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Galili, for this kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to escape from my comfort zone, which is the 18th century, and to say something about the beginning of the 20th century. One of the strongest and intimate documents that illuminate Jewish secularization is Franz Kafka's 1919 Brief an den Vater. In this painful and angry confession, Kafka blames his father Hermann for all his psychological inhibitions, his fears, his failings, and his feeling of inferiority. Could Judaism bring us together? Kafka asked his father, and the answer was disappointingly negative. He didn't get an answer, as we know. It was never sent. At home, he told, religions were limited to the first Seder, Passover, which developed more and more into a farce, admittedly, under the influence of the growing children. And then he is asking, why did you have to submit to this? Because you inspired it. In Kafka's eyes, as a boy, the condition of the religion was as bad as possible. His father knew very well how to function in the synagogue, but he was indifferent to the ceremonies. As for the Passover Seder, the last religious practice that survived in his home, he tended to mock it. Kafka's critique was of what he identified as a hollow pattern of behavior. He himself felt distant and alien. In the synagogue, the Torah scrolls didn't arouse a feeling of sanctity. Rather, they appeared to be a miserable expression of a religion without a living spirit. Like puppets, Kafka said, the bar mitzvah ceremony ought to have changed this, but it also failed. As an adult, Kafka could explain the crisis in transmitting the religious tradition to him. Kafka understood that for his father, it served as a marker of his social class and did not function on the spiritual level at all. Although Kafka was able to explain the historical and biographical context, he found it hard to be reconciled with his failure to pass on tradition, and he said, it seeped away even as you passed it on. The new Jewish home was the product of enlightenment, of emancipation, acculturation, modern education, secularization, and many other processes of modernization. And on the threshold of the 20th century, the foundations of the new Jewish home in most European cities were shaking. The parents failed in transmitting a meaningful Judaism to the children, and the frustrated children became estranged to the religious beliefs and practices. The pioneer study of Arthur Ruppin, 1911's Die Juden der Gegenwart, was the first to describe the broad picture of what for him was the collapse of Judaism, the erosion of assimilation, and national disintegration. And he believed that in whose way only Zionism could stand. Statistical data about Jewish demography and sociology made it possible for the first time to construct at least a basic picture of Jewry in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. A first effort was made by Ruppin to classify the Jewish population according to commitment to the religion and to examine the relationship between preservation of the religion and other trends in the changing patterns of life. Ruppin constructed a hierarchy of 4 different types with respect to maintaining religious norm. The Orthodox, characterized by speaking Yiddish, the wearing of special Jewish costume, and life led mainly according to Jewish law and the rulings of rabbis. Dismissive, he believed, of external knowledge and drawing all their information from ancient Jewish sources. The second group, the tolerant, of whom Rupin said that they were still observant. So, in reference to the most difficult issue in the economic sense, the prohibition against working on the Shabbat, they tended to be as lenient as possible. They were not fanatical in opposing everything that was not Jewish. They obeyed the secular laws of their country, and they did not regard the reading of books in non-Jewish languages as a sin. And the third group, the free thinkers, were defined as a segment, most of whom had rejected Jewish laws, especially observance of the Shabbat. They spoke only in the national languages, but their sons were circumcised, and once or twice a year they attended the synagogue. And the last group, the non-religious, irreligieux, the group that represented radical secularization, who had nothing to do with Judaism, so usually they remained in the Jewish camp and out of some feeling of respect, emotional loyalty, self-conception, or for family and social reasons, and they rejected passing over to the Christian camp. Of about 12 million Jews in the world at the time, about 6 million, everything is according to Rupin, remain Orthodox, whereas the other 6 million had undergone secularization on 3 different levels. 3 million Jews, including the immigrants from Eastern Europe, in America and England, as well as the Jews of Algeria, the Balkan, the lower class in Holland, and those who lived in villages in Austria, Hungary, and the eastern parts of Germany, had all undergone partial secularization, making them moderate in the religious commitment. 2 million Jews belonged to the middle class in Central and Western Europe. They were merchants and affluent craftsmen living in the cities of Germany, Austria, England, Italy, France, Holland, and Hungary. Rupin defined them as free thinkers. They did not observe the commandments, and their connection to religion was very weak. However, their Jewish identity was still important to them. They avoided mixed marriage and circumcised their sons. The fourth and most radical group, whom Rupin called non-religious, included about 1 million wealthy Jews in the big cities of Europe, as well as a group of academics and critical intellectuals. There are many ways to study secularization. Arthur Rupin's sociology is one of them. But in my forthcoming book, The Emotional Experience of Jewish Secularization, I've chosen the history of emotions. I suggest listening to the voices of the trauma of secularization coming out of ego documents and expressing rebellion, frustration, anger, liberation, despair, and nostalgia. Today I will open just a few windows to a few Jewish homes. Kafka's was the first, and will now move from Prague to Petersburg and enter the kitchen of Paulina Vengerov, who faced an exceptional challenge. Her husband required her to adopt a secular way of life in the home. Paulina was born in Bobroisk, White Russia. She was a member of the aristocratic Epstein family who fostered Torah study, and at the age of 17, she was married to the Jewish banker Hanan Vengerov of Minsk. She had children and moved from place to place with him as his profession required. A turning point in the family life occurred in 1871 when they moved to Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, until then limited for Jewish settlement. In her memoir, Vengerov describes her first encounter with a new Jewish community in which the patterns of the tradition were kept only partially. We entered, she said, a milieu of aristocratic, cultured people who lived in riches and luxury. The community did have a splendid synagogue and even 2 rabbis. But, she said, it distanced itself considerably from Jewish custom and tradition. the most distinguished of the Jews adopted many foreign traditions and celebrated alien festivals such as Christmas. Of Jewish holidays, they observed only Yom Kippur and Pesach. Many arrived at the synagogue, she mentioned, in a carriage and took their meals on Yom Kippur during the intermissions. The social pressure was strong. Vengerov reported, and one had to have a very strong character and adherence to the religion to avoid being swept away in the current. She possessed those traits. My own strong faith, my upbringing, and the sincerity with which I clung to every Jewish custom would have preserved me. But a husband, whom she portrayed in her memoir as ambitious and conformist, lacked them. To live in this environment, she said, and to remain unaffected by its influence required a force, character, and religious steadfastness that my husband, unfortunately, did not possess. Paulina Vengerov did not intervene in his way of life outside of the home. She tried to retain the tradition within the home, but this wasn't enough. She described her surrendering to her husband's demand with pain. At the very beginning of our stay in Petersburg, I had to give up my shtetl, and despite the most strenuous resistance, I soon had to give up my kosher kitchen and gradually drive out all beautiful customs, one after another. No, she said, I did not drive them out. I accompanied each one to the outermost portals of my home, sobbing and weeping. My heart bled as I watched them leave. I was sad as if I had accompanied to its grave all that was most precious to me. Changing the kitchen from kosher to non-kosher was the hardest task for her. In return for this sacrifice, she tried at least to retain control over 1 week of the year, the week of Passover, which is celebrated with her family according to the tradition she was used to from her childhood. Our next visit will be to the home of Clara Regensburger of Eppingen, who was raised in an Orthodox family, but immediately after her marriage, at the age of 18, to Joseph Geismar, and their move to Constance, where no Jews at all lived, a void opened in her soul. And it grew deeper when they had to choose the way their children would be educated. I had passed my early childhood in a pious home, she reports, but the new environment into which Joseph introduced me removed me at once and for all from this world. And then there were hours in which I felt empty and unfulfilled. There was a corner of my soul that neither my husband's love nor the most beautiful passages of Shakespeare or Goethe were able to fill. I missed belonging to a religion. She even considered approaching Christianity, but then she and her husband decided to try to bring a little of what remained with them of their childhood into the home. This effort failed in the end, as she went on to write in her memoirs. Expressing pain of the fading of Jewish faith and despair of the ability to restore it in her home, when there was no supporting collective. We agreed, she said, that children could encounter the essence of religion only through its external forms. Joseph desired that we introduce these external forms into our home. As he never bothered with the practical details in any real matter, it was hard to figure out what these individual forms were to be. Above all, Friday evening and the Shabbat were to be celebrated. But if Saturday is not also celebrated by other friends and acquaintances, and especially if the children see their father carrying his weekday activism on Saturday, and that he has his holiday on Sunday, like everyone else
all around us, then Saturday can hardly be maintained as a day of rest. So the outward forms of Judaism, this wall with which it surrenders its God, can only stand when the many Asiatic stones and pebbles from which it is formed hold together. If one removes a single stone, the whole wall shakes and finally collapses. In summing up secularization of the Jews in Germany, Myron Kaplan, who was mentioned here several times, argued that toward the end of the 19th century, the secularization among the German Jews became radical. The law that made it possible to depart from the central community also made it possible for the Orthodox, who chose to segregate themselves and to establish a separate community of their own. Kaplan estimates that in 1900, about 85% of the Jews were not regarded as Orthodox in Germany, and only 55% of the communities maintained a mikveh, a ritual bath. Most of the city Jews no longer observed kashrut. The men abandoned the synagogue and mass, first in the urban communities and later in the rural ones. Religion was diminished in the public sphere and preserved partially in the private realm of home and family. In the private sphere, women were the home priests, preserving a few religious customs. However, Kaplan's conclusion is that this process only weakened religious commitment even further and did not make it possible to convey the religion to the following generation. Since Judaism, she argued, always a religion characterized by decided gender division, and since the two spheres, the private and the public, had always strengthened each other, it wasn't reasonable that only the home could preserve Judaism. And when piety became a woman's virtue, it therefore became less valued. Nevertheless, the more Judaism abandoned its traditional forms, the more the family became significant in preserving Jewish identity in the personal sphere, bridging between secular Jews and the tradition. Their Jews continue to observe essential holidays as family reunion and traditional dinner, where Jewish cuisine was identified as a marker for the Jewish ethnic group, even when it was not kosher. The social historian of secularization in the 19th century in Europe, Ian McLeod, also argued that the Jewish home became the stronghold of Judaism in the age of secularization. This is one of the few studies on secularization where the Jewish example is also included. The importance in Jewish life, said McLeod, of domestic ritual was especially significant at a time when public religious observances were in decline. Even those who had no religious beliefs at all wanted their sons to be circumcised and to be bar mitzvah, and were bitterly opposed to their son or daughter marrying a Gentile. So, in conclusion, I would like to open a last window. The observing the trauma of secularization and the emerging nostalgia to the lost home of Yitzhak Kummer, the protagonist of Agnon's novel, Tmol Shilshom, Only Yesterday. As you see in this conference, Agnon should be mentioned at the end of every lecture, like a lily, yesterday. Agnon's historical and psychological insights were based on his own experience in making the migration from Galicia to the land of Israel in 1908. Kummer, the protagonist of Tmol Shilshom, lost his religion like many others of his friends who believed that the new Zionist Jew, a chalutz, should leave his religion behind as part of exile. Religion belongs to the exile. But Agnon complicated Kummer's fate and did not allow his protagonist to assimilate into the process of collective secularization. It chose to open the wounds of secularization and describe the pain and yearnings entailed by losing the religion. Agnon shows how Kummer was overwhelmed by the melodies of the Hasidim at the Western Wall in Jerusalem and reveals his thoughts when, for example, he described the way he pictures the Shabbat of his childhood home in Galicia. So we look at him through the window of his small home when he was flooded by this wave of nostalgia. So very sadly, Yitzhak sits there, no white cloth is spread on his table, no Shabbat candle illuminates his house, no wine for the blessing, and no plated loaf of bread. But nostalgia was not enough for Agnon. He rolls Kummer backwards against the wheels of history into the Orthodox old Yeshuv of Jerusalem, a Yeshuv Hayashan. As the historian Jacob Katz explains it, liberation from the religion as a belief and practice does not necessarily liberate one psychologically. So in the history of Jewish secularization, the threshold of the 20th century marked the peak of processes whose roots lay in the early modern period. As Charles Taylor has shown, at that critical time, beginning of the 20th century, the alternative open to unbelief are multiplied and enriched prior to their diffusion to society as a whole. Of course, this was not the final episode. Secularization is a powerful force that gave rise to unprecedented global change in private lives, in society, in the state, in the modern age. Contemporary Judaism is post-secular, but because secularization has ceased to be significant, but not because secularization has ceased to be significant, but because all the many rival groups that emerged from within Judaism, without exception, resulted from it. Secularization also shaped Jewish religion as it is known today and gave rise to defensive and militant orthodoxy, to political and religious frameworks, to humanistic and liberal Judaism, and to other ways of creating a secular Jewish culture as an alternative to religion. One might even go so far as to say that God himself was undergoing secularization. Nietzsche's pronouncement about the death of God has not withstood the test of history. True, the God that preceded the age of secularization has almost disappeared, but he has returned in countless conceptions and beliefs. Absolute abstraction and the embodiment of morality and the sublime, on the one hand, and enlistment in political struggle and wars of religion on the other. And I would like to argue that the question, how strong are the new home's foundations, the question is relevant today as it was 100 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shmuel and Elite.
Thank you, Galili, for the introduction, and thank you again for the invitation. I'm going to talk about Jeanne Amery. This is